If you don't already know me, I am Audrey Wilson, the Community Engagement Officer at the Scottish Council and Archives, and I welcome you all to our sixth and the last webinar in the series, Next Steps. It's a follow-on from First Steps Caring for Community Archives, which we toured throughout Scotland in 2019, delivering a one-day training event. So each webinar is an information-packed 30 minutes, which takes place every Monday morning. And today we're going to hear from Eve Wright, Digital Archivist at the National Records of Scotland. Eve will be talking about the digital preservation of Facebook, a social media platform popular with community archives and heritage groups to chat, share photos and other material in their collections. And since we rarely use since we rarely write letters or publish in print group magazines and newsletters, how do we ensure that future generations have a record of their past? So we'll find out today from Eve. Just a quick note on housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Scottish Council and Archives website. I'll also put it on our Twitter account at @CArchivesScot. I'll put that in the Q&A. Please use the Q&A to ask questions. I will be answering as many as I can during the presentation, but I'll also be collecting them later, and we will have a live Q&A session with the presenter Eve at the end of her talk. You will see that there's also closed captions on, and some of you may find this very useful to also see the words as well as hear them. But you can turn this off if you find it annoying in any way. You will see the button at the bottom of your screen. So please do that. But without any further ado, I will now pass over to Eve.
That's great. Thanks, Audrey. That's brilliant. So I'm going to be speaking today about social media archiving, specifically in the preservation of Facebook, as I understand a lot of community archives are already using this platform to engage with researchers and other archiving communities. I'm going to be focusing today on things that Facebook is and isn't, how Facebook can be used as a tool for archives, and what challenges there are in terms of archiving Facebook content. Now at NRS, we aren't currently archiving any Facebook pages, but we did start Twitter archiving at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. This was part of our wider strategy of increased web archiving to capture the impact of the pandemic in Scotland. Now, our decision on not to archive Facebook comes down to selection, really. NRS's depositors tend to use other web formats to communicate to the public, such as their own websites and Twitter as well. But we like not to rule anything out, so it may be something that we focus on in the future. What I would like to say from the outset is that those of us who work in digital preservation and web archiving don't have one magic solution on social media archiving, particularly in regards to Facebook. My recommendations here are based on what available options there are now in March 2021. None of them are perfect, and you really need to think about your archive and your community and what use case best suits your needs. Okay, so everyone's heard of Facebook, right? They're nearing 3 billion users globally, so I imagine most of you are aware of it. Facebook is often held up as the prime example to how the web has evolved from its inception to Web 2.0. Since the emergence of the web, sites have developed from fairly static open pages to this entire virtual community where there's more emphasis on user-generated content and collaboration. I think it's important to note this Web 2.0 distinction when we're looking to archive Facebook. When we think back to when Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, and for those of you who remember the 2012 Olympics opening ceremony, he made it available to everyone. This openness was, generally speaking, archive friendly, and archivists have developed tools that have been able to preserve the web in this form. Now, Facebook, by contrast, is based on the idea that the social network is exclusive. Even if users want their content to be openly available, they have some control over what is shared and what is private. And to a greater extent, Facebook themselves are in control of keeping content within this Facebook bubble. So before we even start looking at the technical challenges of preserving Facebook, this is what we need to confront. It's not a normal website, so we need to think differently about how we could archive it. So one method of harvesting content from social media platforms is using application programming interfaces, or APIs. This is quite a broad concept, but it's generally just a method developers can use to allow applications to speak to each other. Use of APIs could allow users to extract large volumes of data into open formats that could be interpreted and analysed. So in theory, this would be great for archiving. Now you can use APIs to archive some social media platforms. On this slide, I've included a snapshot of my own Twitter page that I obtained using software called Social Feed Manager. This pulls data from Twitter using Twitter's API. Generally speaking, Twitter is far more open of a platform than Facebook, which makes it far more preservation friendly. Now, access to an API is dependent on that platform giving you access to that data. Usually you would need to make the case for why you need access, be it for preservation reasons or academic research. Now, Facebook stopped all but very limited public access to their APIs in 2018 due to the Cambridge Analytica scandal. I think no one would question why this decision was made, especially when you consider Cambridge Analytica obtained this data from a user who only had access to Facebook's API because they were claiming to be using the data for academic research when clearly they weren't. I don't really have enough time in this presentation to go into all of the recent controversy Facebook has experienced in the past few years regarding targeted advertising, fake news, the way they use their users' data. However, it's important to consider why Facebook don't just allow anyone to download data en masse. There's a lot of personal content on Facebook, and we've seen in recent years how powerful and really quite dangerous use of this data can be. Just because we are archivists doesn't mean that we can just take whatever data we want from Facebook. A lot of people would argue that even if they are making content publicly available online, this isn't the same as giving permission for this content to be archived. That doesn't mean that you need to give up on preserving Facebook in some way. I would just say that before starting, make sure that you do make yourself aware of Facebook's terms of use and focus on capturing content in a very targeted, permission-driven way. So are there any ways Facebook pages could be ingested into your digital collections? Yes, there are. Facebook allows you to download your personal data via the settings page. This is very much easy to do. The data is pulled from your Facebook page in a folder structure that replicates the live version. You can download this information as either HTML or JSON. Both of these are very common formats, human readable, and thus preservation friendly formats. So I've recorded how I did this with my own Facebook data. So I'll just let this play here. On the settings page, you're just clicking on your Facebook information and download your information. And you'll see it's just a case of ticking whatever information you want to pull, and there's quite a lot of data here. In the case of myself, I just selected all and downloaded it. You can select the format as HTML or JSON. You just click create file. It can take up to 24 hours. You then get a notification saying it's ready to download, and you download your data as a zip file. So if we have a look at what the information looks like, let this play as well. This is information from my own Facebook page, so you can see the folder structure. It kind of mimics the live version as well. This is one of the pages that's pulled from my page. You can open it up in any browser. And you can also open it up in any text application if you want to look kind of under the hood at what that information looks like. Another really handy thing that Facebook gives you is a little index file. So if you open that up in your browser, it just gives you a little bit more information about what is in each folder. I've spoken a lot about photos in this webinar series. So these are some of my albums that I downloaded. Here's some lovely images of golden retrievers. You'll see the name of the file is very generic. It's definitely not what I named it when it was on my computer. And if we have a look as well at the metadata that's there, there's really not much there. So we can see how much information is stripped out by the process of uploading and then downloading from Facebook. Or you can download videos as well. So you can do like I did, where you can download your ice bucket challenge from years ago. So it's quite fun as well, just to see what you did upload years and years ago as well. Now, what I did do to look in a bit more depth is that I ran the image files through Droid. I'll speak a little bit more about this later on, but it just gives you a little bit more information about what is in the files. And what is interesting to note here is if we look at the last modified date, they're all exactly the same, which is from the date that I pulled this information from Facebook. So we don't have the date that the photo was taken, and we don't even have the date that I uploaded that to Facebook. So it's important to kind of remember that when we are pulling this information from Facebook. So if you do have a depositor that would like to submit their Facebook page to your archive, they can do it in this way. What I would say before doing this, try downloading your own Facebook page. This is good practice for your own personal archiving, but also I think it's really important to understand just how in depth this information goes. I found it quite alarming. I personally wanted to turn my phone off and throw it out the window. But if you do review this in your own data set, you can advise your depositor what personal data, things like location settings, direct messages, friend requests, should be removed from the data set prior to transfer. Now, I'm afraid that's about as far as it goes in terms of Facebook's tools for downloading data. You can only download your own personal data and not from a set page or group. In terms of archiving this type of content, we can start looking at more general web archiving techniques. You might be familiar with the concept of a web crawler. It's like a little robot that goes through all the links, gobbles up all the content, and outputs a really complete interactive web capture. The most well-known instance of web archiving in this way would be via the Internet Archive. Some of you might be familiar with the Wayback Machine, where you can essentially go back through time through various captures of a web page. Now, there are open source web crawlers that are available. One example would be an application called Conifer, which you can access via a web browser. What I would say about using crawlers is that they're not really that adaptable to Web 2.0 platforms like Facebook. You'll see even in this snapshot on Wayback, the crawler hasn't got any further than a login page. This is mainly because these types of sites are highly dynamic. You need to be constantly scrolling and clicking, and there's also a lot of multimedia. This type of content really confuses the crawlers. They sometimes get a little bit lost, so the quality of the crawl would be impacted. If you do want to archive a Facebook page in this way, be prepared for it to take a lot of time and patience. And remember what we said earlier about permissions. Just because you can capture the content doesn't mean that you should. So because of these issues with dynamic content, you could look into more simple ways of preserving the pages that we wouldn't usually recommend for web archiving. If all you're wanting to preserve is an image of a successful engagement event or a post you put up on your Facebook page, you could save the page as PDF or take screenshots. We wouldn't normally recommend taking snapshots in this way for web archiving because you're losing any interaction in the links and any real depth. It would also be very time consuming and not really scalable at all. So it would only really be appropriate if you do want to capture a really small amount of content. What this does allow is for you to capture the content in a very controlled way. And if you remember, this is very important when we're talking about Facebook archiving. Now, as we've gone through the very limited way you can download content from Facebook, I hope it's quite clear that you should never assume uploading content to Facebook is a way of keeping it forever. Even if we disregard how difficult it is to download content from Facebook, it's never good practice to solely rely on a third-party web page to store your data. I know in this webinar series, we've discussed images a great deal. I think if we think back to the photos we examined earlier, we saw that Facebook only captured the image itself. It didn't capture the original file name, and any metadata, including importantly when the photo was taken, has been stripped out. This means it's not a great preservation copy, and you need to remember as well, Facebook has limits on resolution. So the photo has likely been compressed and reduced in quality in some way. It's for this reason, it's always worthwhile to keep original copies when you're uploading any content to Facebook. The way you're storing your content doesn't need to be complicated by any means, but there's a few fundamental actions you can do to ensure the long-term preservation of the records. Keep more than one copy on secure media. If you can keep 3 copies, even better. If you can keep your copies on different media types and in different locations, the better still. Also be aware of hardware obsolescence. Anything on a floppy disk or optical disk, you might not be able to access this even in just a few years' time, so make sure you are making copies from these media types. Keep the files secure. This comes down to restricting access to the media and also just ensuring that any files are scanned and quarantined before being ingested into your digital collections. For both of these aspects of security, look carefully at the settings you're applying. You don't want passwords to be forgotten or antivirus scans to automatically delete files if a threat is found. So just make sure these settings are applied in a considered and well recorded way. Now, as with most aspects of archiving, documentation is king. At a minimum, keep high-level descriptions of what is stored where. Don't think that just because it's digital, it's searchable. Finding aids are still required in the digital age. There is additional documentation you need to think about when it comes to storing digital records, mainly concerning the context and the format of the files. For paper records, you will already be recording your provenance, your admin histories, but for digital records, you also need to be asking, where were these records originally stored? What software was used to open the files, and what file format are they? Recording this information is really important to ensure the files can be preserved and replayed over time. Now, there are tools available to help record this. One open source option is Droid, which we use at NRS, and I used to profile the image files from my Facebook page earlier. Droid was developed by the National Archive UK. It will identify the file format and provide you with lots of useful information that will help you to ensure the long-term preservation of the files. I think also make sure you are monitoring what you have over time. Check that your files aren't changing at all as time progresses. You can use the checksums that Droid produces for this. Also monitor at-risk formats. The best way to do this is to keep an eye on the Digital Preservation Coalition's bit list, where they publish digitally endangered species. You can also use your Droid profiles to check the file formats you have against any that are at risk. I think on that note, I think it's important not to panic too much about file obsolescence and go too far and just start converting everything to PDF. A far more useful use of your time would be to ensure that your documentation is up to date and that you can locate everything in your digital collections. It's far more likely that your digital files will be lost via accidental deletion or bad migration than it would be via file obsolescence. So only do what you need to do when you need to do it. And I think lastly, I've spoken a lot about how Facebook can be quite problematic for archivists, but what I should also say about Facebook, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, it's a brilliant resource for engaging with potential researchers, communicating within your organisation, and for developing your network with other archives. Now, I'm by no means an expert on social media, but a few quick tips that never really go wrong. Keep it visual. Put posts together that will attract the eye of a scrolling user. Beware the read more. Longer posts would be better suited on a blog or a website. Keeping posts short would attract more interest. Reach out to specific communities, use groups and pages to your advantage to find those who would be most interested in your content. Beware version control. So it can be quite easy to lose content on Facebook. If, for instance, you're wanting to share a copy of your finding aid, you don't want to be adding version after version directly to Facebook. What might work better is only having one up-to-date version hosted on your website or a well-managed Google Doc. You can then regularly post links to that document, and you know it will always be up to date. And I'd say as well, just branch out. There's lots of social media platforms out there, and there's real kind of like generational divides forming around them. If you use lots of different platforms, you're more likely to get a wider audience. So as with sharing of content, of any sharing of content with the public, posting on Facebook needs to be done sensitively. Make sure you do have a takedown policy in case anyone does approach you with queries on what you've posted. If done right, having a really frequently updated social media page with a high level of engaged followers will really give a lot of life to your collections. I think a really good example of this recently was Nathan Evans, who got really into 19th century sea shanties. He posted versions of these on TikTok. Other users made remixes of them, and now he's #1 in the singles chart. So what I'm saying by this is you never know. You don't know who's going to be inspired by what and at what time. So just going to put things out there and let the virtual community do the work. And I think that's pretty much me.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Eve, for that. A lot of food for thought. I think a lot of people were listening intently to what you were saying. So take this opportunity, everyone, to ask your questions using the Q&A button. You will see it. It's at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A, and I will ask Eve on your behalf. Some questions that have come in to me beforehand is just talking about the quality of the image that's lost when you upload from Facebook. I mean, is that something that's a huge concern, or I mean, should you be saving it maybe obviously in another way as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of people discuss the challenges of digital preservation, and there are a lot, but there's a lot of things that you can do with digital files that you maybe couldn't do when you have analog records. So you can keep lots of copies, which is great. So keeping a copy on your computer or with your digital collections is always going to be better than just having a copy on Facebook. You've seen that they strip out pretty much everything, the original name, any metadata that's there. So having that on your computer, you've got your copy to preserve, and you've got a copy that you can use in your Facebook page for access reasons as well.
Okay, that's great. Sorry, you mentioned as well the Wayback Machine. Sorry, could you say a little bit more about it? That's another question.
Yeah, it's really fun if you've not ever looked at it before. So Internet Archive is a not-for-profit. They've been around for quite a while now. So if you go onto the Wayback Machine, you can type in any web page URL, and it's like a little time machine. It'll just kind of take you back through like captures that have been taken over the years. And when you're looking at things like Facebook and what it looked like in 2005, it's really quite interesting. So it's great because it's capturing the web, which is such a huge resource, but it's also really fun as well. So it's worth having a look at.
Is there, just before we leave that and go on to Abby's question, I was going to say, is there one that we should maybe look at? Is there a good one that you would recommend?
Oh, I think like the older the better. Like I know, well, I've got to say, you've got to look at NRS's web continuity page, because that's where we have our web archive. We've been doing a lot of increased capturing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So have a look at our page. That's the best one.
Oh, sorry, I just got a little bit on, my connection was unstable there, so I can see we're okay. I'm back on now. I want to ask a question. Can you hear me, Eve?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep.
Hmm. I am not seeing.
Sorry, RJ, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry, I might go on and off. I'm going to say as well, if that happens, maybe have a quick look on the Q&A
Yeah, sure.
myself. But if I'm still with you, sorry, I don't know, it kind of comes and goes a little bit, my connection there. Is one from Abby regarding permission. We asked people to tag us in to their lockdown images so we could add them to our image collections. Is tagging implicitly enough to allow us to screenshot them and add them to our archive?
That's a really
It's
good
a sort of
question.
copyright.
A
Yes.
lot of people, if you ask them, like, can I archive your page, will say, yeah, of course. So, I've put it online, it's publicly available, it's fine. I think what you're saying there, where you're asking people to tag them, you'd need to make that more explicit. So just kind of make that clear from the outset. Like, you're never going to go wrong in making it really clear. So say that by tagging us, you're saying you're giving us permission to archive it in our collections. Just making that clear, it's going to really cover you in case anyone does come back and say, oh, I didn't give you permission for that.
Right. Okay. Going on to another question from Mark Wallace. I manage in New Haven. It is a very active with lots of old stories and useful information being posted. Is this is the only way I can capture these by transcribing it?
I wouldn't say transcribing would the best way to do it. It's definitely is very time consuming for you. So I did speak a little bit about, you could look into web crawlers, and you could also look into more simple ways of preserving it, like taking screenshots. Um, if you're, I suppose it depends how much information you're wanting to kind of look through. The most complete way to do it would be looking into a web crawler. But if you're just wanting to kind of capture images of the page, I know, I think Microsoft Edge offer a web capture tool that essentially just takes a really big screenshot. So what you need to do is just go through the page first, click read more on everything and make sure everything's open, and then capture the whole page. Doing it that way, it takes a lot of time and patience, and you'll need to do a lot of kind of quality assurance between what's live and what you've captured in your screenshot, but that might be the best way to do it. Also, just remember about the permissions thing. So just because you can capture everything doesn't mean that you should capture everything.
Yes, thank you for that, Eve. I'm going to have, there's one more question that has come in to me on email, and it's, we talked about a Facebook here, but do you think you should also have a website? Is that safer?
Preservation wise, it's easier to preserve a website than it is to preserve a Facebook page. You've got more kind of clear links that you could go into and archive, whether that's via a crawler or via another method. I think just in terms of the usability side of things, you can put longer posts on like a blog or a website, and on your Facebook page, you can do just kind of links to that. So it's useful to have both. So Facebook is great because most people have a Facebook page, and you can really get things out there, but having a website or a blog it is really kind of useful because you can get right down into the detail and kind of put that out there as well. Also, in terms of if you want to archive your blog or your website, you can go onto the Internet Archive page and go onto, I think it's like save a page or save a URL, and that will just take a snapshot for you. You can't do something like that with Facebook. I think if you did try, it wouldn't be a very good capture, but you can try that if you do have that information on a website as well.
Great. Well, before I take Ian's question, actually, I'm going to just go back. Abby's asked another one, and I think it relates quite a lot to talking about quality here. She mentions that I'm downloading data from personal Facebook pages. Does this capture comments other people have added on your page?
Yes, it does. I think Facebook kind of, they give you access to that because it's on your comments and it's what people have put on yours. But it's another thing that like you should advise your depositors on before they send that information to you. Just because it's your personal information doesn't mean that other people are in there. Like Facebook is such like an internet connected thing, it's really difficult to just get your personal information. So it's maybe something that you need to go into and do an assessment of before it's ingested into your digital collections.
Yes, and maybe our last question actually, which is from Ian Whitaker. Due to the sheer volume of digital images, is there a way to automatically generate or link any original image metadata to the Facebook downloads?
I guess if you have a copy in your digital collections and you have a copy on Facebook, um, if you downloaded the copy from Facebook, you could kind of cross-reference between the two. But there's no way to kind of upload that your file with the metadata onto Facebook and to keep that. It just gets stripped out, and this is what I'm saying, Facebook are in control really, in terms of what happens to the images of what goes in. So it does get stripped out. I don't really think there's a way you can get around that when you upload anything to Facebook.
It's great. Now, I am aware there's been a lot of information there today, Eve. Is there an email address that you have at the National Records of Scotland that I can send out to people after today?
Yeah, of course. If anyone has any further questions, best way to contact us would be digital_records@nrsscotland.gov.uk. I'm quite happy to have discussions, and yeah, if any kind of other aspects of social media as well, we're kind of look into everything. So yeah, just let me know if you do have any further questions.
No, that's great. Because after today's webinar, I'll send out a recording to everyone who signed up and also a feedback form. So if you could please fill in the feedback, and then we can do more of these training events and actually bring you things that you want to hear more about, such as this Facebook one, for instance. It's been very popular. I just want to say thank you to Eve very much for doing this for us today, and hopefully we will see you again at some point in the near future. But thanks for everyone for attending. Any questions, please do send me an email. I hope to see you all soon. Okay, bye.
That's great. Thank you. Bye.